assume most of you are familiar with, but Bishop Stuart Ruck in the Diocese of the Upper Midwest and William Beasley, the Missioner General of the Greenhouse Movement, who have worked together and partnered together for probably 25 to 30 years now, with very distinct giftings, we all think was an inspired vision for the types of ways that we plant churches that are different and distinct from one another as being grounded in a biblical way of describing it. And so they came up with this language and used it at the Provincial Assembly for everyone that dioceses now are talking about and trying to figure out. And it's the idea that there's a Pauline way of church planting and there's a Petrin way of church planting. And just to briefly describe these two different ways of church planting based on sort of Paul and what the fruits of Paul's ministry was through his missionary travels, and Peter and what the fruits were of his church planting and his ministry. The way we think about the Petrin is the Petrin tends to be focused on building the church and growing the church and has a greater tendency to be focused on the worship structure, the worship style, and trying to bring people in the church into greater and greater connection with God through worship and the beauty of holiness. And the Petrin model, the Petrin folks would tend to be more focused on what God has called them to do and will tend to say no to lots of opportunities for great things so that they could stay focused. They tend to build systems that will help them grow, and they tend to engage in things like establishing a cathedral or even a building to permanently root themselves in a community so that in the future they can do wonderful things like plant new churches. But even when they do plant new churches, they tend to plant in a way that has been popularized in our culture, which is to grow a large team and then to plant with as many people as possible, trying to exceed the 100 attendance number because of all the statistics about how hard it is to get over 100 if you plant small. And there's a real focus on self-sufficiency financially, self-sufficiency, and even in the past, there was sort of the emphasis on you can't plant a church unless you have a building. So you have to raise the money. So I think in the 80s, it was understood that if you plant a church, you've got to have at least $1 million. Now they say you need $500,000. So they've kind of accepted the fact that you can plant and be a mobile church or in a rental situation or whatever. The Pauline expression of the church and the church planting is Paul tends to be more flexible to context, more adaptable, and he doesn't necessarily come in with a rigid definition of what it means to be the church. And so wherever people are gathered to worship God and have received Jesus, he calls them the church. And so even now in the ACNA, we sort of define a church as 50 people, ASA, average Sunday attendance, without being financially dependent on other churches for their ministry, which is not listed anywhere in the Bible. It's just a pragmatic definition. So Pauline people are willing to be more flexible on the definition of what a church is. They're okay with the different ways that people will gather. It may not be on a Sunday morning. It's probably not going to be in a building they own. They're not going to focus as much on creating this beautiful, gorgeous worship. They're going to focus more on reaching those outside the church and trying to start new churches. And so they aren't going to raise a lot of money and plant big all the time. They're going to be really open to the leading of the Holy Spirit to be missional. And so the Pauline church really, the Pauline and the Petrin really need each other. And that's what Stuart and William really cast at the provincial assemblies how much we need each other. The Pauline really needs the Petrine church to tell them, you guys are the church. Especially with structures and definitions that say you aren't the church. They need the Petrine church to say, you guys are the church. You guys are a legitimate church. You are a part of the church. You are the church. Because a lot of these Pauline folks that are highly adaptable and creative sometimes struggle with that insecurity that, are we the church? Do we count as the church? And the Petrine church needs the Pauline church to say to them, you guys are on mission. Because they tend to be focused on growing the church, and sometimes they struggle with a sense of, you guys are so missional, you Pauline people, that do you even count us as being missional? Do we count? Do we qualify as being missional? And the answer is yes, of course. So we have to affirm each other with the charisms that have been given, because worship and mission go together. John Paul II said that the church needs to breathe with both lungs, and those lungs are worship and mission, and they have to go together like sisters go together, hand in hand. So we need each other, but we also have to bless the distinctions and the characteristics of Pauline folks and Petrine folks, folks that tend to want to be more adaptive and creative, like how do we contextualize this liturgy to the people that are gathering here on a Sunday or whatever day of the week they meet for worship. Petrine folks would tend to take like the most beautiful liturgy and try to recreate it everywhere they go. Whereas Pauline folks would really be adaptable to the liturgy and try to figure out, how are we going to make this work so that the people gathering together worship the Lord with all of their hearts, not just in the form or the ritual of the liturgy itself that was so meaningful to these folks over here in the big church. Does that make sense? And so even how we answer these questions is really highly adaptable based on whether you're thinking in a Petrine sort of way about church planting or whether you're thinking in a Pauline sort of way about church planting. If you, as a church planter, get a coach, and that coach is Petrine, he or she is going to tell you to do things or to wait to do things based on their Petrine values. And a Pauline coach is going to tell you to do very different things based on their Pauline values. And so that it's a way in which we have to understand the different ways people are wired and the vision God's given them. So I self-identify as a Pauline guy. I love to be highly adaptive and flexible and to bless whatever it seems like God is doing in any group that wants to grow the church. But I was in a Petrine environment for 20 years. And I love so many things about the Petrine world that are conducive to mission. So I love both. I self-identify as a Pauline guy, if that makes any sense, for where we're at. So what I want to do is to be highly interactive in terms of discussing these things, facilitating discussion. As much as you guys have asked me to come and offer what I've learned for you guys, I really want to learn from you guys to take back to Chicago and to influence our environment there based on what's happening here. So, Victor.
So either hypothetical or actual, can you tell a story about a church plant that looked Petrine?
Yep.
And a church plant that looked Pauline?
Great. So in Chicagoland area, we have the Cathedral, Church of the Resurrection, that was started by a Pauline guy, William Beasley, and then he handed it over to a Petrine guy, Stuart Ruck, so that William could go and plant another church. And William planted multiple churches in the years that Stuart was growing the church that William had handed him till it was 1,200 people. So I was Stuart Ruck's first hire at Church of the Resurrection, and we were about 150 people. And I was on staff until we were 1,200 before I was sent to help a multiplying church in the city to grow. And in those years, Church of the Resurrection planted several churches in a very Petrine way. They identified a leader, They sort of incubated the leader for years at the cathedral or at the big church, giving them lots of ministry experiences with children's ministry and youth ministry and worship and communications and pastoral care and healing ministry. And then that person was given permission to gather folks. They were put in the ordination process because the Petrin model says you need to be a priest before you can plant, right? Because when you plant, you've got to be able to do the full liturgy, the full extent of it when you start. So the person's going through the ordination process, getting their seminary training, and being ordained. And they gather their team, and the goal is you have to have 50 people on your launch team in order to start a Sunday. You put your launch date on the calendar probably 6 months after you've reached 50 people on your launch team. You're also fundraising and building up $250,000 to $500,000 before you launch. And you're launching with several full-time staff members based on that fundraising that you've done. The person isn't raising funds for themselves, they're raising funds for the whole church and building a budget so that they plant day one with an annual budget. So they have systems in place already, an identified vestry, identified staff, the priest, ordained leader, and when they plant, have that launch Sunday, they do a lot of communication promo so that they have over 100 people at their first Sunday worship.
How about location? How does that work?
Yeah, they strategically choose a location that they're going to plan in that will be financially self-sustainable long term. Okay, that's really important. So they're avoiding environments that won't be financially self-sustainable. Think college students on college campus, nursing homes, rural environments, poor communities. They're going where they can, within the first 3 years, become a membership of over 100 and have enough money to pay for the staff members that they started the church with the fundraised money from outside people. Does that make sense? It's a great question on location. So a Pauline church then, hey, welcome.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No problem. So a Pauline church would discern, where is God calling us to reach people? Where does it seem like something is happening? Anywhere. And the sky's the limit. It could be the nursing home, it could be the college campus, it could be rural or poor neighborhoods, it could be urban, suburban. They're thinking, where is God calling us? And the leader doesn't have to have a seminary degree. The leader doesn't have to be ordained. They're following the leading of the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit. And so a leader may come to someone like me and say, I'd really like to start a church. This is where I've got a heart to start one. I've already started gathering people. We have a Bible study maybe that's going on every week, and it keeps growing, and we've seen people come to know the Lord in the Bible study. So then I would say, that sounds great. Keep gathering people, and let's see as we connect on what God is doing in your group. And it may be the same length of time that a Petrin person would take to plant, or it may be much shorter. Let's just say that their Bible study's grown to 20 or 25, and we decide, you know what, this can be its own congregation. So we release that lay leader. We might commission them as a catechist, which is our language for lay pastor, to lead that group. They come up with a name for it, like we want to be Saint Augustine, and they give it this really cool hipster name. And they go from Bible study to trying to design a Sunday worship liturgy that meets the needs of the people. Generally, the Pauline folks are going to start with a lighter liturgy, because most of these folks who are attracted to the Pauline church aren't Anglicans. So they're evangelicals, or they're folks who are really not familiar with a lot of church. And these folks are not going to want long services initially. They're not going to want heavy liturgy. and they're going to want to be able to bring people they know don't go to church into this environment. It's the highest level of invitation and fastest growing for church planting. The stats on church planting being the number one method for evangelizing the completely unchurched is super high. It's the most effective method of all evangelism methods, is starting a new congregation. So they design a liturgy that is very receptive to outsiders coming in. Really hospitality is like off the charts usually, super high, and very personable. These kinds of Pauline churches almost always have some component of food involved in their weekly gathering.
In addition to the body of Christ?
Yeah,
You're saying?
yeah. In addition to bread and wine, they usually have some kind of food and beverage. I mean, coffee is a big deal now for Pauline churches. And so they usually, a lot of Pauline folks are highly adaptive and creative, and so their creativity leads to different ways of worshiping together that touches people's hearts, you know. So they will try to make the worship creative, like hospitable, like a family, or sitting around a dining room table, but also bringing people into the heart of the gospel. So some of them are going to be more charismatic, more music-oriented, less liturgical. The folks that really do love liturgy will start with sort of the shortest Eucharistic liturgy that the Book of Common Prayer allows for. And because they're not ordained, they're always going to be connected to someone who is ordained, who provides authority connection and sacramental connection, which is going to get to the sacramental church planting, so that there's some way of providing communion with a non-ordained leader. They debate over when to introduce communion, because introducing communion does draw a line in the sand for folks who are coming in. Communion is always, at least in our context, and I imagine most of ACNA, it is, the line in the sand is communion is for the baptized believers. They're for those who are following Jesus. So when you offer communion, you're basically saying to folks, we're so glad that you're here, but communion is for the baptized believers. And so they strategically decide when is the best time to introduce it, as the group has transitioned from whatever it started as, a worship and prayer group or a Bible study, into a Sunday service. And they might offer it every single Sunday when they start offering it, or they might offer it periodic as they sort of, it's a little bit like putting a frog in water and trying to boil it, is you just turn up the heat slowly. And liturgically, in the sacramental church plant, we use the liturgical seasons, like Advent's coming, and when Advent comes, we introduce another liturgical component. And then we transition to Lent, and in Lent, we offer another liturgical component. So you're kind of dialing it up slowly. It's strategic for these churches not to dial it up too quick, because if they do, they end up attracting just folks who are oriented a certain way. Not to be offensive in any way, but like the liturgical nerds are the ones that are drawn in to a dialed up, fast liturgical or sacramental environment. And there is a real way in which evangelicals or non-Christians are hungering for a lot of this stuff, but they can't take it all at once because it's too many questions, too many struggles. So you got to dial it slowly up for those that have that calling. Lots of debating around what do you wear, vestments, no vestments, how much vestments, because there are so many layers of vestments. And those can be obstacles for people. So they tend to keep their services around an hour and 15, trying not to go into the 2-hour mark, which is where a Petrin church would feel more likely to go, with the full expression of everything that you can do. And so, Phil and a few others are great examples of starting a Pauline church, where everything that I just described is the process that they go through. And when they start, we call them a church. It doesn't matter if they're 50 ASA or 20 ASA, we call them a church. And we establish their processes for collecting an offering, and they are part of the bigger church because they don't have an ordained leader. So they are one congregation in a church that has multiple congregations. Yeah.
How do you go about answering the question of what is essential to an Anglican worship service?
Yeah. So in our area, we're really blessed by having a canon theologian that is commissioned by the bishop to answer that question for us.
Okay.
Because we like to stay in submission to our bishop. It can't be about people's personal opinions or personal preferences. So in my process of being ordained to the priesthood, I had gotten the whole seminary degree thing, but my bishop was like, you're probably weakest in liturgics. So I'd like to send you somewhere to get a good, solid liturgics class. So he sent me to the best prof there is in the country on liturgics at Nashotah House, the guy's no longer there. His name is Arnie Klukas, and he is like the coolest guy ever on liturgics. Unfortunately, what I learned is even at Nashotah House, which is the highest sort of liturgical snobbish place you could possibly go, everybody who is an expert disagrees with the other experts on what is essential.
Awesome.
So there's not like this. There's not like this universal like if you just learn enough of this, you will be in agreement with the experts. And they all disagree, and they all have different reasons for the customs that we have. Like, why do we do this? Oh, it's because of this. No, it's because of this. And so there's even different narratives behind the things that we do liturgically. So what it comes down to, obviously, is authority. Who is your authority, and what will they permit you to do or not? Okay. Right? We know that some dioceses, the bishop will allow a catechist to distribute communion, and in some dioceses they won't. Right? Based on the bishop's authority. And they're trying to discern what's best for growing the church. Some dioceses have different views on what they can call a church. So we have these other words, like under 50, you're a missional community. And if you have a priest leading an under 50 group, they're not a rector, they're a vicar, things like that. The Pauline people want to jettison all of that because it's unhelpful to say you're under 50, you're a missional community, you're like sub-church. It communicates something to the people. You don't count. Or you're not important enough for like a bishop visit. And so we try to jettison all of that stuff and just say you're the church, and we will figure out how to make the money work, and we're gonna be adaptable and highly flexible for all the ways that money could work for your environment. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, so so there's room for creativity, but it's a creativity that's still sort of submitting to some of the authority that's over it.
Yeah.
There aren't necessarily black and white guidelines, but you have to be intentional about what you...
So in our environment, we go to the dean, and the dean brings his questions to the bishop. And the bishop in our area has decided there's so many questions because we're all challenging what we can do and what we can't, that he said, let the canon theologian answer the questions, because it's just a lot of questions. And our canon theologian is highly sacramental, and so it's really wonderful how flexible and Pauline he actually is, even though he is like highest liturgical expert. He's the guy who does the Word and Table podcast. If you have not heard it, Alex Wilgus with Stephen Gautier, Canon Stephen Gautier, is the Word and Table podcast, which are 10-minute episodes.
Or 10 to 20.
10 to 20 minute episodes.
Let me just speak a word to that. I really highly recommend that everybody listen to that, to the Word and Table.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Yeah,
It covers the
subscribe to
whole barrage of theological.
Yeah, but it is also a snapshot of liturgical issues and sacramental issues. And so through Greenhouse Movement, we have actually rolled out an entire online coursework with Canon Stephen Gautier that is a live online cohort with him for 90 minutes a session. And he's got a whole curriculum that he's laid out for liturgical sacramental education. We call it St. Paul's House of Formation. And so you can, at the beginning of a semester, you can sign up online and be a part of an online live cohort with Canon Stephen, where you hear the teaching with other people online and you can interact with Canon Stephen and ask questions. We just launched it this fall.
Great.
So it might be something to consider for next fall. There is a cost, but it's very small. It's like a few $100 as opposed to $1,000 for a college credit. So it's like $300 for a year, or I don't know, 26 weeks or something like that.
So
Yeah.
let's say a church plant wanted to have somebody doing live art during the context of the worship service. How would the canon theologian interact with something like that? Like what kind of criteria would he apply to saying whether that was acceptable or not in the worship?
Well, there's nothing to say that that's not acceptable. It would just be about, is it fruitful? Is it godly? Is it worshipful? Is it appropriate for the context?
As
are the
dean,
questions.
I would just like to say no nudes for that. That would be more fitting.
We're obviously trying to remove obstacles from worship, not add obstacles to worship. So those are the things to take in consideration. But our environment in Chicago is a huge artist environment. Okay. Obviously, the nature of the city of Chicago, I assume it's like that in Nashville as well. There's just a lot of artistic talent. And so these artists are basically conveying the gospel through a different medium. And so all mediums are valid.
Okay,
good.
I don't know how we're doing time-wise, but Lori, keep us on track.
Keep us honest, Lori.
I would like to know if you could give a minute or two to common fails, like how people started well and kind of it crashed, or how they just were dead on arrival.
That's awesome. One of the things that is helpful to reassess is the notion of failure. The Petrin model tends to think about failure, and the Pauline model does not tend to think things that started and stopped are failures. We don't think that way. Right. And you know, I don't know, maybe it's not fair to say that Petrin does, but there is a sense in which you start something and it doesn't continue. The tendency, according to the old church planting method, is to gather everybody together and figure out what went wrong. There's nothing horrible about that, but it's not open to the possibility that God acted through those 2 years that it was meeting. So we find it really helpful to make a list of all of the fruits that were born while the group was meeting, and to affirm and express gratitude for what God did, to redefine what success and failure are.
That's great.
Because success and failure are a little too narrowly defined in church planting in a way that really hurts people. If out of the statistic that's going around is 3 out of 4 church plants fail, is the stat that's used, meaning isn't still in existence several years later. I just don't like the word fail. William hates the word fail. So we started a church on Monday nights for restaurant industry folks who could never go to church on a weekend. And it was led by a bartender, and he saw people come to the Lord and be baptized, offer great pastoral care, Bible study. People grew in the Lord, but 2 years later, it stopped meeting. And so it was really important for us to have a time of celebration over what God did instead of talk about what went wrong or why this failed. Because God, he's not focused on like the specific metrics of success that we are. And so we try to be more open to what success actually is. And so for us at Greenhouse Movement, success for us is following the leading of the Holy Spirit. And if you're following the leading of the Holy Spirit, just to be faithful to what God's called you to do is the measure of success, rather than how many people are coming, what your budget looks like, how many other churches you've planted, whether you still exist. I mean, like, those aren't the metrics of success. It's, are you following the leading of the Holy Spirit? Are you being faithful to what God's asked you to do? And so there needs to be some encouragement and care for folks when a congregation does stop. But for us, with multiple congregations, when a congregation stops meeting, the people simply come back into the congregation that's still connected to the larger church. So the Petrin way of doing church planting is one vestry, one priest, one congregation for the church. The Pauline way of church planting can mean one priest, multiple congregations, and a parish council or vestry that represents all those congregations. And so when one congregation ceases to exist, the church doesn't cease to exist. There's several other congregations, and the people simply connect into one of the other congregations. So you're not really losing people. Also, when you church plant the Petrine way, generally you are casting a vision in the church. We need folks who are going to plant a church in Aurora with this leader. He's really great. It's a great vision. They really need Jesus, and they gather together as many people as they can. Those people represent donors in the church, givers. So they're figuring out how much money they're going to lose, how many people they're going to lose, and how long is it going to take for the bigger church to recover from planting a church, right? And then 3/4 of those churches fail, and they've lost all that money, and they may lose all those people, right? Is that how it tends to work? In a church with multiple congregations, you're sending people out, but they stay in your church. You're sending out givers, but they're still giving into the same account. And so if it doesn't exist a year later, you haven't lost anybody in the process of planting a new church. So there's no recovery. There's no loss. And so a church planting in a Pauline way can plant as many as God raises up with no consideration for how much is that going to hurt or how much loss is the church going to incur. So they can really release leaders to plant churches as often as they want, anytime they want. When I had 2 congregations that looked like they were going to plant at the same time out of the congregation that I was leading, the Petrine coach in my life said, you don't want to do that. That's not wise. So you've got to tell one of them to wait a year so that you can recover from planting the first before you can plant the second. And the Pauline coach said, that's perfect. That's not going to hurt you guys at all. And as we did it, as we stepped into it, we actually saw the giving at the original congregation that I lead go up strangely as we lost givers to another congregation giving into the same account. So our net giving went up at both locations. So there wasn't even a dip at one location. Am I right, Phil? Yeah. And so we're like, holy moly, there's now a surplus of money. How did that happen? So does that answer the question? No? Yes? Who asked that question?
Victor, or it's like an example of a church that failed.
Yeah. So we kind of moved on from that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I would just like you to lean a little bit further into the idea of vision casting, perhaps in the context, because most of the time when I've read about vision casting, it's very much the Petrine DNA. And it's never fit me quite right. And so I'm wondering, what does it look like in the Pauline context to cast vision for gathering people to,
Yeah. Do you want to answer that?
I could, because my wife and I are planting a church, and we've just kind of walked. Yeah. So my wife and I are planting a church. We're kind of in the process of going from a prayer group to a congregation proper, haven't quite made that final step. But we have just walked through the process of leadership team. And our vision from the get-go was really just to be, this is the school that we both attended, the school that my wife and I met at, and we just wanted to provide space for students to grow deeper in their relationship with God, and specifically to provide space for spiritual gifts and for people to grow in those. So our vision was very kind of just connect students to the Spirit, release students in the power of the Spirit to, connect with other students. So we that was our vision. I don't need to go into all the details at this point, but just to answer your question, we've really seen that vision kind of shaped and honed as we've gotten more students involved. And the first guy we connected with, he's big on preaching the gospel and calling people to repentance. He actually, there was one summer that he and another guy, part of our group, went downtown to the shopping district and were just street evangelizing and street preaching, just at all these passerbys. And so there's a real passion for the gospel. And as we were moving into this next season, he was saying, so how we've gone now is we have a weekly prayer group. We've added a weekly worship night. We just had our third one, actually on Saturday in my absence, which I was a little anxious about, but it seemed like actually my absence was helpful in getting other people to step up. So this guy that we first connected with, he preached for the first time for us, and my wife said it was great. I haven't had a chance to listen to it, but so his really focus on the gospel got us thinking more about, okay, we want to preach the gospel. So in that sense, and I should say also this couple, boyfriend, girlfriend that we connected with, they really had on their heart to start worship nights. And we felt the Lord calling us to something new in October, something new in this fall. We ended up going away from, we thought Sunday morning services, but we felt instead that the Lord was leading us towards weekly worship nights. And so in that way, we've really allowed the gifts and the kind of calling, the vision of the people that we're connecting with to shape our overall vision. It's still within our initial vision, connecting people to the Holy Spirit, but we've really seen, this guy's passionate about preaching the gospel. So now the way we're thinking about it is we want to minister the gospel. We really have it on our heart to have healing, to be ministering healing prayer. So minister the gospel in the sense that those who don't know the Lord have the opportunity to respond. Those who do know the Lord have the opportunity to receive the truths of the gospel to their deep heart. So in that sense, ministering the gospel.
Yeah, what I've observed is the Petrin way of vision casting is generally to do a lot of the work pre-launch on vision casting, putting together the vision, making it specific and clear, and presenting it to people and inviting them to come into it. Yeah. The Pauline way of vision casting has tended to be have a broad understanding of vision, and as the church gets started, inviting people into shaping the vision. So the vision actually gets shaped a little bit later after starting, because they want the folks that they've gathered in to own what it is that they're doing together. Yeah. And so that's a dynamic that I've seen, which goes to the whole higher flexibility, higher adaptability to the environment and the people that come. So that's been really helpful for how to distinguish between those two. And as I came into this environment, I actually noted that a lot of the Pauline churches didn't have vision initially. I kept asking everybody, what's your vision in this church, and what's your vision? And they were like, well, our vision is to be the church. Yeah. Because that's the Pauline struggle. We need somebody to tell us we're the church. And I was like, be the church is not a vision. You've got to do more than be the church. You've got to reach the lost. You've got to do these other things. So we started a process of identifying vision and creating vision, and that was really helpful for these folks who had really started without a clearly articulated vision. Does that answer that question? Or are you talking about how to present it?
I'm wondering, Raphael.
Yeah, what about you, Raphael? What were you thinking?
As I mentioned before, I'm about to meet with several people who are interested in the possibility of a church plant, and I guess I'm wanting to know, how to go about it. What expectations should I place? I mean, I don't want to go in there and impose my vision.
Mhm.
I want to make space for sort of the collective giftings to come about in forming
Yeah.
that. But then I'm concerned of how do I follow up with that?
Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah. And what's the ask at the end of the vision cast for this particular upcoming meeting?
Yeah, that's right now. It's just, do you want to go forward together in starting a church?
So are you asking them to support the vision financially? Are you asking them to be on your leadership team? Or are you asking them to be on your launch team?
I guess I'm looking more for a leadership team.
Okay? So that the ask needs to be clear. Whatever you're asking in the vision cast. And so even in a Pauline way of planting a church, you've got to identify the need in the community. So you're planning on planting in Reading. So you have to be able to articulate the need for a plant in Reading. What's God's put on your heart broadly to do. So I tell people I'm passionate about evangelism and healing. Those are the two things that have got to be in whatever it is that I'm planting. And an invitation to actually be on your leadership team, shaping the vision with you for how that gets, whatever the broad picture is, how that gets expressed out. Yeah, Joshua.
Can you emphasize, maybe instead of vision, values up front? I'm thinking of you, Raphael, just in your context, I'm trying to reach out to potential leaders, say, these are the things that we value, and the values can be very distinctive, very unique for us, that aren't necessarily things that every other church in the area is doing. So these are our values. For example, we care about evangelism, we care about liturgy and like a strong sacramental connection and apostolic connection, and anything that we do is to be informed by those two values. Those are what make us distinct as a church plant from every other church plant in the area. And then based on those values, as you gather a team, then form a vision together where you can very specifically say, this is our vision for what a church is going to look like that's going to implement these values. But maybe come in strong with what you think your values are. I would say use the word values or distinctives.
Yeah.
Maybe like these are the things that set us apart. Like we're pretty clear, I think, in terms of what our distinctives are, like what our core values are as a church here in Roseville.
Yeah.
And some of those are things that we share with other churches in the area, but some of them are definitely very unique in terms of the combination of all of those things.
You also need to know what you can and cannot work with. Phil, as he's talked to several folks he's wanted to be on his leadership team, he's had to make it clear that he's under authority. This is not an independent thing.
Yeah.
And so, they have to and are invited to meet me as the rector, to connect with me, to know that we're in a broader structure of authority, and to have some conversation around that. And the second thing is we have to be on the same page theologically, particularly when it comes to sexual immorality. We have to be on the same page. You cannot start a church with different theological perspectives on the sexuality issue. It will be a train wreck. And everybody will need counseling after it's over. So everything else, apart from your essential, creedal essential theological beliefs, everything else I feel like you can flex on.
Wouldn't you also add just like making sure they're up to moral standards?
Oh yeah, their own personal lifestyle.
As leaders. you're
As
saying.
leaders. They have to have certain sin issues under control in their life to be on your leadership team.
Technical question too. This leadership team, and I'm kind of open to any of the different possibilities for this, but would this or could this be the vestry, or I'm thinking someone who, like an accountant or someone who works in finances.
Yep, I would be slow on forming the vestry, and I would just start with leadership team, and then you can adapt your leadership team into two bodies, staff and oversight People use different terms for their oversight. It could be vestry, it could be parish council, board.
We're using the term proto-vestry. And
Proto-vestry is totally fine.
Proto is a great word.
But when you start, you could definitely, neo-vestry, you could definitely start with just a generic leadership team, and then as you see people interacting on that leadership team, figuring out where they best fit. The board, proto-vestry, whatever, are really great for the people who have a gift of discernment and wisdom and make good decisions together. The staff, ministry team are the people who actually are action-oriented. They make things happen. And action people are frustrated on vestries, and you get frustrated with discernment, wisdom people on your staff because they don't do anything. They just have lots of opinions.
But they think about them deeply.
They think about things very deeply, but they don't actually accomplish.
That's a really good discussion.
And you need your staff to be doers. But initially, just a leadership team is fine. And having a regular gathering of leaders that are praying together and figuring out what to do together as you begin. So,
On a related question, if you're getting together sort of a launch team or a proto team, and you have people who are pretty diverse in their, not necessarily in their beliefs, but in their practices. So let's say you have someone who's very Anglo-Catholic and sacramental, and then you also have someone who's very artistic and out of the box thinking, and then you have someone who's super, super charismatic in their leanings. How do you bring people from, because sometimes you put those people together and it's like a big cat fight.
oh man, I want all of my leadership teams or launch teams to have all three of those.
Okay, so how do you bring them together
I want
without
them
them like ripping each other's eyeballs out?
No, yeah, absolutely.
How do you do that?
This goes to like the conflict management, right? Wherever that was, handling conflict is you don't want everybody to be identical. Like that's just ridiculous. You would actually see the things you don't like about yourself in other people and hate them. We want the diversity of the gifts of the church together, and none of these are mutually exclusive. None of them are. So you want to bring them together, and you want to affirm. And as the leader, you have to have a love for all of these. You have to love liturgy, sacraments, charismatic, evangelical, gospel-centered, community. You have to love and want these things. Because if you have in your own heart a hatred for something like liturgy or charismatic, or you just cannot stand anyone talking about evangelizing, you're going to have a hard time leading. Because these are all very core to the gospel. So to have a love for all of, let's just say those three, and to affirm them, and to keep casting a vision in every leadership meeting how we need all three of these.
Good. Yeah.
We need these.
Good.
We need each other, and we will figure out together how to do this. And we'll keep talking about things. And if you get into debates over, do we do cassock and surplice, or do we do like hipster outfits as leadership, that's not, the discussion really isn't about that. The discussion is deeper. It's about the tension of the Anglo-Catholic liturgical value and the evangelism value, right? That's the tension. And so you have to take whatever the symptomatic debate is about to its core root. Hey guys, what we're actually debating is how evangelistic we're going to be, or how sacred and worshipful we're going to be. That's what this debate is about. And either way is okay, but we're going to work out together what it's going to take. And I'm just asking everybody to be flexible. Because we may make a decision to go with the hipster outfit and then decide 6 months later we really don't like it. Then we might transition and make a change later. And I want everybody to be okay with the fact that we're going to be trial and error and figure out what helps the people connect with God. So, Lori just told me she has 10 questions. I'm just joking. 10 minutes. What else do you guys really want to hear about here? As we've gotten through some of that.
If you have a secret to planting rural, I would love to hear it.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah. We debated this in the car on the way here because it is a little bit more challenging. Like, we know how to plant churches on college campuses. We know where to start. But when it comes to rural communities, I think what is best to pray about is not can we find someone and send them to that rural community, but can we find somebody, can God lead us to someone in the rural community who wants to lead a church? I think it's really important that they're already rooted in the community and they already have circles of relationships.
That's a great point.
I don't know. I think it would take a really long time to find someone, send them in to begin developing credibility. Small communities are really about trust and longevity and stability. So we're first and foremost praying for the Lord to lead us to the person that he's calling to raise up a church. All right? And then you're meeting with them to develop that vision. And developing the strategy for how to begin. Because you've got to, they basically can't start anything unless they can tap into those networks of relationships. And the essential gift that's needed in starting a new church in a rural community is the gathering gift, the ability to gather people. And it can be over anything. It could be over baking and sharing recipes. It could be over gardening, or it could be over sharing tools. I mean, it could be over anything in the rural community that gathers people together. That was from Lori. Lori's brilliant.
She is.
So any effective way of gathering, if you have someone who wants to do this but cannot gather people, you really can't start anything. There are all these great ways to get the word out. I mean, even Facebook has like a Facebook ad that you can spend $50 and it will blast the news about this new church to everybody in an actual region, in the circumference around a spot, to everybody who lives in that region. And so you can actually get the word out through something like that. For Phil, his prayer and worship group started because he posted in a Facebook group that was created for North Park.
Well, someone found us in an old Facebook
That's what I'm
group.
saying.
Oh, yeah.
There was an old Facebook group that hadn't been used in years that existed for people praying together at the university. Phil was like the were you just in the group, or were you the manager of the group?
We, my wife and I were like admins or whatever.
Admins on the group. Somebody comes to the university as a freshman, does a search on Facebook, and sends a message. Do you guys still meet?
Wow.
Can I come?
And he's the guy who preached on Saturday.
And that's how the group started.
Hey.
Nice.
And that was the guy who found them. So the Lord will make these connections if you can figure out how to at least like create an open door online somewhere. Well, I think even rural communities are discovering things online.
Yeah.
I think. So yeah.
As to the final item, I just want to comment on that. Ed Stetzer is probably the best, most knowledgeable statistician on church
Yep.
planning and all.
Do you guys all know who Ed Stetzer is? Okay.
He made this just stunning announcement that there's no correlation between the amount of money raised and the likely success of the church.
Did you guys hear that? No correlation between the amount of money you raise and the success
Yeah.
of the church.
Which just blows all the Petrine theology away.
Ed Stetzer loves William Beasley.
I know they're great friends. Yeah.
Loves William Beasley's
Yeah.
vision.
He likes Lori too, because she's been very helpful to him.
Oh, good.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is when I was in Ethiopia, that also blew my mind. That raising funds was just not that big a deal. That wasn't what they did before they planted churches. They just planted churches. Now, in 30 seconds or more, can you talk about our connection to Africa, the African revival, and why Greenhouse is an
Yeah,
attempt
that's good.
to express that?
So what William was primarily inspired by was the way that churches were raised up rapidly in the East African revival. The issue was the church was raised up faster than they could ordain people, which is what led to the lay catechist or lay pastor leadership of a church. As long as they were connected to a rector or a senior pastor that was ordained, they could have as many congregations in a region as people wanted to raise up congregations. And they figured out how to make the sacramental connection work, how to do their services. And a lot of these people who started churches were bivocational. They already had some means of funding, some means of support, and of course, the rector allowed them to collect an offering in their services that was a part of the funding of that person. But these are folks that basically did ministry for a small amount of money, or they were bivocational, or they had funds that allowed them to do what they felt called to do. And so that was the primary inspiration from the East African revival, so much so that they got to a point as a region, and this was inspiring for me, where let's just use Sacramento as an example. You have 6 congregations here where they would grab all of the leadership, not just the ordained leadership, but the leadership teams of every congregation, got them together for one Friday night event where they had music and they had somebody who was the best in the whole region preach the gospel, and they had an altar call, and it was designed to be in a location where they wanted several churches, right? So they preach the gospel,
Okay.
and they have like 2 or 3 folks that want to start congregations, and they start the weekend of the event. That Sunday is the first service that they have. So Nigeria does this not to plant churches. They do this to plant a whole diocese in one weekend. That's what they do.
Wow.
Is that amazing?
That's awesome. I love it.
They, like, once a year, they strategically get together and they plant a new diocese.
Let me be vulnerable there
Yeah.
and ask you. So, and if you don't mind being put on the spot. So some Friday in January, we should all go to Reading and have this big
I
time.
absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, that would be super cool.
And everybody goes door to door,
Yeah.
giving out invitations, offering to pray, bringing like little things of coffee from this really sweet coffee place, the Fig Tree, and everything's naked. Is that still the brand you use? Everything's still naked, and the whole community hears at once.
Yeah.
What's going on? They plan a few Facebook ads to hit at the same time. Not in Nigeria.
No.
But here, I mean, they don't even have like water, sewer, and electricity.
Yeah.
So,
Do you guys
wow. Yeah.
Water sewer.
Yeah. Little Wi-Fi issues. So, yeah. So I hope that's helpful.
That's extremely helpful.
Is the 4-minute warning for departure or for lunch?
for lunch.
Okay, so we don't have to depart. Great. We can actually keep talking as we eat if you would like to, because I know that we haven't covered all of these. But we did talk about starting from scratch and contextualizing liturgy.
Follow up on the East African revival. Are there any books or resources on that
Yeah.
particularly?
Yeah, we love using
Spontaneous.
The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church by
Rolling out.
Roland Allen, St. Paul's Methods or Ours.
Yeah.
But that does that touch on the East African revival?
It's more China, wasn't it?
Was it China?
But it's still the principle's there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one. That's our go-to. There's another one that we love by Roland Allen. Do you remember the other book? The other name? I can't remember it.
From a statistical, analytical point of view, Stetzer's Viral Churches is a look at different movements in North America
Yeah.
that have really multiplied it.
Yeah.
Some of the commonalities there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I don't know. I haven't heard of any resources on the East African revival specifically.
Yeah.
But
Might be
they're
too
not
new
out there.
for there to be a whole lot.
But with Greenhouse, we can go there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We have reciprocal mission.
Yeah,
Tell us
exactly.
about that as you're closing.
One of the things that Greenhouse Movement loves is developing these two-way relationships with other parts of the church and other places in the world. It's not your old standard missionary relationship where the white church in America that has all the money goes somewhere in Africa to the poor people who have no money and tell them how to do everything properly and give them money for things that are really important, like air conditioning in the church, without like really knowing or understanding the community that they go to. Sort of like it really is reminiscent of the colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, developing a relationship with people overseas in a humble posture of, we need you guys to teach us what you do and how you do ministry so that we can learn from you, and developing that mutual exchange of giving of ourselves to the other that is not controlling or white-centric or money-centric.
Eurocentric.
And so we've developed this now right now with Kenya and with Brazil, where people are coming to us once a year and we're going to them once a year on our own dimes. And then once you go there, they provide everything that you need, housing and food, and they deploy you in their communities and their churches to do whatever they think is most needed. And when they come to us, we deploy them in whatever way we think is most needed. It's not about going shopping, getting souvenirs, having time to connect with family members in the area. You're on mission together. And we learn from each other how to do ministry through reciprocal mission. So, yeah. Well,
Bedtime?
Should we bless the food?
Please.
Yeah. Joshua, do you want to bless the food?
Sure.
You love food.
I do. I love food and I love people. And we got, I love Jesus too. We got all those here in the house, so that's great. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Our gracious God, we thank you for the many great blessings that you give to us. Every good thing we have because of you. We thank you for the greatness of this gathering. We pray that you continue to teach us and that we'll be able to learn from each other and learn from your Spirit as we reflect upon what you're doing in our communities and through the greenhouse movement and through the various church plants that are represented here today. I pray that you would continue to bless this time of learning and that you would inspire us and give us new vision to partner with you in this area, in this region, and see the expansion of your church. And I just thank you so much for the honor to be able to participate in that. I thank you also for the food that we're about to partake of, and I ask that you would bless it, that it would nourish and strengthen us, bless ourselves to your service. And I pray that the rest of our time together today would be a time where we can be iron sharpening iron, encouraging one another and uplifting one another, and also, again, just being able to receive a fresh vision from you for what you would have us do in this region. We give this time over to you now, and we thank you so much for everyone here and for your work in our midst. In Jesus' precious name, amen.